It was a typical Tuesday morning in the city. The sun had just begun to peek through the clouds, casting a golden hue over the bustling downtown streets. Commuters hurried along the sidewalks, cars packed the intersections, and coffee shops brimmed with people getting their morning fix. For Judge David Taylor, it was just another day. A day he anticipated would be filled with routine court cases and administrative work. A well-respected figure in the city, David had built a reputation as a man of integrity, fairness, and unwavering commitment to justice. He had been serving as a judge for nearly a decade, and his presence in the courtroom commanded respect from colleagues, lawyers, and the community alike. On this particular morning, David decided to stop by a local cafe on his way to the courthouse. Known for their rich espresso and friendly baristas, it was a favorite spot of his. He enjoyed these small, solitary moments before diving into the demanding world of legal disputes and hearings. Clad in a crisp suit, with his briefcase in hand, David approached the cafe counter, greeted the barista with a warm smile, and ordered his usual. As he waited for his coffee, he glanced around, soaking in the familiar sights and sounds of the bustling morning. Outside, a newly transferred police officer, Sean Malone, was on patrol. Sean was young, barely a year out of the police academy, and had only recently joined the city's police force. He had come from a smaller town with its own set of norms, and perhaps certain preconceived notions. Eager to prove himself, Sean had been rigorously patrolling the downtown area, keen on making a good impression. His eyes scanned the streets for anything out of the ordinary, looking for any sign that might warrant his attention. As fate would have it, at that very moment, a report came through Sean's radio about a recent burglary in the area. The dispatcher gave a vague description of the suspect, a tall black man in a dark suit. Sean's pulse quickened as he absorbed the information, his training kicking in as he mentally prepared to act if he spotted anyone fitting the description. Just as he processed the report, he noticed David exiting the cafe, coffee cup in hand, dressed sharply in a dark suit, and briefly pausing to check his phone. To Sean, David's appearance seemed to align suspiciously well with the description he had just received. Without hesitation, Sean approached David with a determined stride, signaling him to stop. "Excuse me, sir," he called out in a voice that was both authoritative and cautious. David looked up, mildly surprised, not accustomed to being stopped by the police. Sean's tone was professional, yet there was an underlying intensity as he continued. "I need to ask you a few questions." David felt a jolt of unease but remained calm, accustomed to handling tense situations with poise. He looked Sean in the eye, a hint of curiosity mixed with confusion. "Certainly, officer," he replied, maintaining a calm demeanor, "but may I ask what this is about?" Sean tightened his grip on his radio, his expression shifting to one of suspicion. "We had a report about a suspect matching your description involved in a recent incident," he said, his eyes scanning David up and down as though he were assessing a potential threat. David raised his eyebrows, momentarily taken aback. He thought of explaining his role as a judge right away, but decided to see where the conversation would lead, curious about the young officer's approach. "I understand," David said, nodding slightly, "but I assure you, I haven't been involved in any incident." Sean's eyes narrowed, his stance rigid as he seemed to interpret David's calm response as evasive. "Do you have any identification on you?" he asked, his voice a shade sharper. David felt a stir of frustration but remained composed, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. He offered his ID to Sean, who examined it closely. The badge and title were impossible to miss. David Taylor, Circuit Court Judge. Sean's eyes flicked over the ID, and for a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face, but he seemed unable or unwilling to let go of his initial suspicion. A small crowd had begun to gather, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Bystanders pulled out their phones, quietly filming the exchange, and whispers began circulating. "Is that Judge Taylor?" someone murmured. "Why is he being stopped?" Another person whispered, their tone tinged with disbelief. David could feel the weight of their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and concern that only intensified the tension. "Look, officer," David said, his tone steady yet authoritative, "I'm on my way to the courthouse. If you have questions, you're welcome to contact the department." He gestured toward the City Hall building just down the street, hoping to subtly remind Sean of his position and the absurdity of the situation. But instead of backing down, Sean's expression hardened, his pride and determination seemingly taking over. "I'll ask the questions here," Sean replied, his voice carrying an edge of defensiveness. "You say you're a judge, but that doesn't place you above suspicion." David's jaw tightened. He had encountered bias in various forms throughout his life, but this encounter felt different. Here he was, a respected judge, a symbol of justice in the community, being subjected to suspicion and scrutiny on the very streets he served to protect. Yet he remained composed, knowing that any show of anger or impatience could easily be misinterpreted. Instead, he responded, "I'm more than willing to cooperate, officer. But I believe you're making a serious mistake here." Sean seemed momentarily taken aback by David's calm resolve, but he quickly recovered, doubling down. "Please place your hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice louder now, as though trying to assert control. The crowd murmured in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others filming more intently. A palpable tension filled the air as people recognized the stakes of the situation unfolding before them. David raised his hand slightly, a gesture not of surrender but of patience. The murmurs grew louder, and more people stopped to watch, sensing the injustice in the officer's approach. Several familiar faces in the crowd looked on in shock, silently urging David to remain calm. Among them was a local business owner, an elderly woman who had known David since he was a young man. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Officer, do you even know who you're talking to?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Sean glanced at her, irritation flashing in his eyes as he repeated, "Please stay back, ma'am. This is a police matter." The woman shook her head, her expression one of disbelief, but she complied, stepping back while still watching the scene unfold. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. In the span of a few minutes, a simple coffee run had spiraled into an intense public spectacle, all because of one officer's misguided suspicion. Then, just as the situation seemed ready to escalate further, another officer arrived, a senior officer who immediately recognized David. His face paled as he assessed the scene, realizing what was happening. He approached Sean, his voice low but urgent. "Officer Malone, step aside," he said firmly, gesturing toward David. "This is Judge Taylor." Sean's expression shifted from defiance to a mix of shock and discomfort as he processed the revelation. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the crowd's anger was palpable. Bystanders voiced their disapproval, and several people shouted questions at the officers, demanding answers and accountability. Sean's face turned pale as he took in the crowd's reaction, and a flicker of doubt appeared in his eyes. He looked at David, a sense of dawning realization and regret crossing his face. The crowd's anger was no longer directed solely at Sean, but had taken on a broader, deeper meaning, symbolizing years of frustration with the systemic injustices faced by people like David. As Sean stepped back, David lowered his hands, his composure unbroken. But inside, a wave of conflicting emotions surged: anger, sadness, and a profound sense of disappointment. He glanced at the faces in the crowd, seeing in them a reflection of his own feelings. The impact of this encounter had spread far beyond the two men involved. The city's long-standing racial tensions had been brought to the surface, and this single encounter would soon ignite a conversation that would ripple through the entire community. David, sensing the weight of the moment, straightened his jacket, nodded briefly to the senior officer, and quietly resumed his walk toward the courthouse, leaving a stunned and contemplative crowd in his wake. The incident would not end here. It would soon spark discussions, debates, and an outcry for change, forcing the city to confront its own biases and question its values. This was more than just a mistaken identity. It was a moment that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved and leave a lasting impact on the community as a whole. David Taylor had been a fixture in the city for as long as most people could remember. He was not only a respected judge, but also a pillar of the community, a man who commanded admiration not just in the courthouse, but also among the people who knew him personally. To them, he was a reminder that dignity and perseverance could indeed overcome adversity. David's path to becoming a judge had been marked by struggle and hard-won respect. Growing up, he'd faced the kind of quiet, systemic prejudice that settled deep in the bones of the city, hiding in the small looks and hushed conversations that people thought he didn't notice. But David noticed everything. His father, a factory worker, had instilled in him a relentless work ethic, while his mother, a schoolteacher, had taught him the power of patience. She always told him that life was a long game, that no one's true character was revealed in the good times, but only during moments of challenge. As a young man, David had poured his energy into his education, refusing to let any setback define him. He was determined to prove that he could transcend the boundaries others tried to impose upon him. Over the years, he climbed the ranks of the legal world, taking on cases that many others would have shied away from, and earning a reputation as a fair and principled judge. But while David's life had taken him from the rougher parts of town to the bench, the city itself hadn't changed as quickly. There were still remnants of the same quiet prejudices, unspoken biases, and simmering tensions, and in recent years they had begun to bubble up to the surface once more. Minor incidents of racial profiling by the police had left many in the black community feeling on edge, and recent events in other cities had only heightened the sense of mistrust between the community and law enforcement. Although the city had a progressive image, many knew that certain attitudes were deeply entrenched and difficult to change. David had watched the city's racial tensions simmer over the years, hoping he could play a part in easing them. He'd spoken at public forums, hosted workshops, and served as a mentor to young people from underserved communities. To the outside world, he might have been seen as a successful figure who had made it past the barriers many others faced, but David knew he was no exception to the prejudices woven into the fabric of the society he lived in. His experience with Officer Malone that morning was proof of that. It was a stark reminder that, despite his achievements, he could still be reduced to a mere suspect by someone who didn't know him or his history. Officer Sean Malone, meanwhile, was facing a different reality. Having grown up in a small, predominantly white town, he had little experience with diversity, and even less with the subtle nuances of the city he now called home. To him, being an officer was a noble duty, one he had pursued with a fierce sense of purpose. His training had been rigorous, filled with lessons on the importance of vigilance and staying alert for any potential threats. But no one had taught him the value of empathy or how to navigate the unspoken rules of a diverse community where mistrust of the police was often justified by experience. The city was a different world for Malone, one he struggled to understand. He'd seen the protests on television, read about the calls for police reform, and heard his colleagues speak about the challenges of policing in an environment where they weren't always welcomed with open arms. He thought he understood what it meant to be a good cop, and he wanted to make a positive impact. But his actions that morning had been driven by fear and a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance, traits that were exacerbated by his unfamiliarity with the community he was now sworn to protect. After the incident with Judge Taylor, Malone returned to the precinct, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. He could still feel the eyes of the crowd, their disapproval burning into him as he tried to justify his actions to himself. But no amount of self-assurance could shake the nagging feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. As he sat in the precinct locker room, replaying the encounter in his mind, he began to realize just how deep his assumptions had gone. It was a bitter pill to swallow, the kind of realization that cut to the core of who he thought he was. Back in the community, news of the encounter spread quickly. Videos of the incident circulated on social media, sparking outrage and disbelief. Many people who hadn't personally known Judge Taylor now found themselves drawn into the story, sharing their own experiences with profiling and prejudice in the city. David's face was everywhere, and the incident took on a life of its own as people began to question not only Malone's actions, but also the broader patterns that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. The conversation quickly expanded, with local news stations picking up the story and activists calling for immediate action. City officials held emergency meetings to discuss the incident, scrambling to address the growing unrest. The mayor released a statement condemning racial profiling and promising an investigation. But for many, it felt like empty words. The community had heard similar promises before, only to see little change. Activists, faith leaders, and community organizers seized the moment, holding public forums and demanding not just accountability for Malone, but a complete overhaul of the way the police department operated. They wanted real reforms, transparency, and a commitment to addressing the racial biases that had plagued the city for so long. David, for his part, tried to stay out of the spotlight, focusing instead on his work and attempting to process what had happened in his own way. But it was impossible to ignore the impact his experience was having on the city. Friends and colleagues reached out to express their support, and strangers stopped him on the street to share their own stories, some tearful, others angry, all of them echoing the shared frustration. It became clear to David that this was no longer just about him or Officer Malone. It was about a system that had failed to protect its citizens equally. As the days passed, David began to feel a sense of responsibility. He had always believed that justice was not just about the law, but about fairness and equality, values he had tried to uphold in his courtroom. But now, he was being called upon to uphold those values outside the courtroom as well. The incident had forced him to confront the reality that even as a judge, he was not immune to the biases that permeated society. He realized that his position gave him a unique platform to speak out, not just as a victim of injustice, but as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The incident with Officer Malone was transforming into something larger, something that went beyond the two men involved. It was becoming a catalyst for change, a rallying point for a community that had long felt ignored and marginalized. The city was awakening, its people no longer content to accept the status quo. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now being held openly, with people demanding answers, accountability, and most of all, change. And in the midst of it all, David found himself at a crossroads. He had spent his life building a career based on principles of justice and fairness, but he now realized that those principles meant nothing if they couldn't be upheld in the real world. His encounter with Malone had forced him to reckon with his own role in a system that was, in many ways, deeply flawed. He knew that staying silent was not an option. He had to use his voice, his influence, to push for the change his community so desperately needed. As he prepared to take a stand, David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his parents, his mentors, and the people who had believed in him even when others doubted. He thought about the young people in the community who looked up to him, who saw him as proof that they, too, could rise above the limitations society tried to place upon them. And he thought about the responsibility he now bore, not just as a judge, but as a member of a community that was crying out for justice. David knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He would face opposition, criticism, and perhaps even retaliation. But he also knew that he could not let fear dictate his actions. He was not just fighting for himself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, the pain of being judged not for who they were but for what others assumed them to be. And so, with a sense of purpose that was stronger than ever, David prepared to step into the public eye, ready to advocate for a future where stories like his would no longer be a reality. The city, too, was ready for a change. The people had grown tired of promises that led nowhere, of a system that seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in protecting the rights of its citizens. And in Judge David Taylor, they saw a leader, someone who understood their struggles, who had experienced the same injustices, and who was willing to stand up and demand a better future. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point that would shape the city's identity for years to come. And as the movement for change began to take shape, everyone knew that things would never be the same again. The days following the encounter between David Taylor and Officer Sean Malone were a blur of tension and activism. Social media had exploded with footage from the incident, and the city's mood had shifted from one of simmering discontent to outright indignation. David's quiet dignity in the face of wrongful suspicion had resonated deeply, igniting a powerful wave of solidarity among residents. For many, this incident became the embodiment of a struggle that had long simmered beneath the surface, a reminder that no one, not even a judge, was immune to prejudice, and that justice itself was at stake. David had tried to go about his duties, hoping the commotion would die down, but it only grew louder. People began to gather outside the courthouse each morning, carrying signs, chanting, and calling for reform. Young activists, elderly community members, parents with children, all united in their demand for accountability. The city was at a boiling point, with calls for change echoing through its streets. David couldn't ignore it any longer. He was part of something much larger now, and he felt a duty to speak up, not as a judge, but as a member of the community he served. Meanwhile, Officer Malone found himself in a different kind of turmoil. His world had turned upside down overnight. He had joined the force with dreams of becoming a hero, someone people could look up to, someone who made a difference. But now, he was the target of public scrutiny, his name circulating in whispers and angry comments online. He was on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, a standard procedure but one that left him feeling exposed and uncertain. Each day, as he waited at home, he wrestled with his conscience, rethinking his actions and what they said about him. Malone's family and friends offered support, but he could feel their unease. Conversations were tense, words left unsaid hanging in the air, and he could sense the underlying disappointment. His parents had always instilled in him a sense of fairness and respect for others, and now he felt he had let them down. He hadn't been trained to deal with situations like this, where one wrong assumption could unravel his career and alienate an entire community. For the first time, he began to question the nature of his role and his place in the city he had sworn to protect. As the investigation unfolded, David found himself pulled into the center of the city's demands for reform. The mayor had reached out to him, urging him to help calm the public, to assure people that justice would be served. But David could sense the hollowness in those words. He was no stranger to political gestures, and he knew that this was about more than appeasing the community. This was about creating meaningful change, change that would outlast the headlines and have a lasting impact. He felt a sense of responsibility that went beyond his role as a judge. It was a responsibility to the people who had suffered in silence for too long. When David was invited to speak at a community forum organized by local activists, he accepted. It was held in a high school auditorium packed with residents, reporters, and community leaders, the energy in the room charged with anticipation. As David walked onto the stage, he could see faces filled with hope, anger, and a yearning for something better. He stood in front of them, humbled by their faith in him, and began to speak from the heart. "I never expected to be here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I became a judge because I believed in justice, in the idea that every person deserves fair treatment under the law. But what happened to me shows that we still have a long way to go. If I, someone who has dedicated my life to upholding justice, can be treated as a suspect on the very streets I work to protect, then no one is truly safe from prejudice." The crowd erupted in applause, some people standing, their voices joining in a chant for justice. David let them express their frustration before continuing. "This isn't just about one encounter," he said, gesturing to the people before him. "It's about a system that allows such encounters to happen, a system that fails to see the humanity in each of us. Today, we have a choice. We can let this incident become another headline that fades, or we can make it the spark that finally brings change to our city." The applause this time was thunderous. The mayor, who was sitting in the front row, looked both uncomfortable and resigned. He knew that the momentum was too strong to ignore, and that the city would have to act. David's words had struck a chord, and the forum became a rallying cry for reform. The following day, the mayor announced that an independent review board would be established to investigate incidents of profiling and misuse of authority. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction, and it gave the community a sense of hope. Meanwhile, Malone's life took an unexpected turn when he received a letter. It was from a young man named Jamal, who had grown up in the same small town as Malone, but had moved to the city years ago. In the letter, Jamal shared his own experiences with law enforcement, describing how he had always felt uneasy in his hometown, where he was often the only black student in his classes. He wrote about the times he had been followed by police for no apparent reason, how he had been pulled over for routine checks, and how those experiences had made him wary of the very people who were supposed to protect him. Reading Jamal's letter, Malone felt a wave of guilt and confusion. Jamal's story was one he had never considered, a perspective that was foreign to his own sheltered experiences. It forced him to confront the fact that his actions weren't just isolated mistakes, but part of a larger issue that affected real lives. Jamal had written, "If someone like you, who grew up in the same place as me, can see me as a threat, then what hope do I have in this world?" Those words lingered in Malone's mind, shaking him to his core. A few days later, the community held a peaceful march, a show of solidarity for David and a call for change. The march moved through the city's main streets, thousands of people coming together, young and old, from every background, united by a shared purpose. Signs held high read "Justice for All," "End Racial Profiling," and "No More Silence." David joined the march, walking with the crowd, his presence a symbol of resilience. Strangers approached him, shaking his hand, thanking him for his courage, while parents pointed him out to their children as someone worth looking up to. At the same time, Malone was beginning his own journey of understanding. He decided to attend the march, standing on the sidelines, hesitant but compelled to witness the movement he had inadvertently sparked. As he watched the crowd pass by, he saw faces filled with both hope and pain, people who were determined to make their voices heard. A sense of humility washed over him as he realized the depth of what he had been blind to, the collective hurt he had unknowingly contributed to. The march ended in the park, where David addressed the crowd once more. He spoke of hope, unity, and the need to move forward together. "This city belongs to all of us," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "And if we are to truly live up to its promise, we must be willing to change, to confront our flaws, and to build a future where every person feels safe and respected." After the speech, Malone approached David. His steps were hesitant, his head slightly bowed. When David saw him, he felt a rush of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a deep sadness. Malone extended his hand, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked with regret. "I didn't see it then, but I see it now. I never thought about what it must feel like on the other side. I'm sorry for what I did, and I want to do better. I want to learn." David regarded him for a moment, seeing the young man's vulnerability and the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, he shook Malone's hand, a silent understanding passing between them. "Change doesn't happen overnight," David said quietly, "but recognizing the need for it is the first step. If you're willing to learn, there's hope yet." The city took that moment as a symbol, a sign that transformation was possible. Conversations shifted from anger to progress, from frustration to rebuilding. David and Malone's handshake became an image that circulated widely, representing a moment when the city chose to take a hard look at itself and commit to a new path. It was the beginning of something bigger, a movement toward true justice, equality, and understanding that would reshape not only the city, but also the lives of everyone who called it home. The days following the march were filled with a renewed sense of purpose in the city. The symbolic handshake between Judge David Taylor and Officer Sean Malone had ignited a powerful desire for reconciliation and reform among residents, who were now looking to translate their frustrations into meaningful action. David knew this momentum couldn't be squandered on empty gestures or performative statements. It had to lead to real, tangible changes in the community and within the justice system that served it. As David returned to his courtroom duties, he found himself haunted by the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He was no longer just a judge overseeing cases. He had become a reluctant symbol of the city's struggle for equality. His courtroom, once a place of quiet authority, was now filled with people who looked to him not just for justice in the cases he presided over, but for proof that change was actually happening. Every day, more community members showed up, filling the gallery with hopeful eyes, as if each ruling he made could signal a shift toward a more equitable future. Meanwhile, Officer Malone was undergoing his own reckoning. The encounter with Judge Taylor and the overwhelming response from the community had forced him to examine his own actions, biases, and beliefs. Under the guidance of his precinct, Malone was enrolled in a series of anti-bias workshops and sensitivity training programs, but the learning didn't stop there. He took it upon himself to seek out community leaders and activists, hoping to understand their perspectives and confront the limitations of his own worldview. The process was uncomfortable, often challenging him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he was determined to keep moving forward, no matter how painful the revelations about himself might be. At the same time, the city was actively working on establishing the independent review board that had been promised in the wake of the incident. The board, comprised of community leaders, legal experts, and social justice advocates, was designed to oversee cases of police misconduct and racial profiling, providing an unbiased voice that could help hold officers accountable. The mayor appointed David as a special advisor to the board, recognizing his unique position as both a victim of injustice and a highly respected member of the judiciary. David accepted the role cautiously, aware that the community would be watching closely to ensure that this was more than just another bureaucratic panel. In one of the board's first meetings, David found himself seated with an array of individuals from all walks of life: local business owners, civil rights advocates, faith leaders, and even a few retired police officers. As he listened to their stories, it became clear that while they shared a common goal, their perspectives on how to achieve it varied widely. Some believed the answer lay in more stringent police training, others called for better recruitment standards, and still others advocated for community policing models that could help rebuild trust. David's role, as he saw it, was to bring these diverse voices together and guide them toward a unified approach. One afternoon, as the board was deep in discussion, a woman named Layla Jackson spoke up. She was a longtime community activist and a grandmother who had lost her own son years ago in an incident involving the police. Her voice, weathered but strong, carried a powerful conviction. "This board can't just be about checking boxes and making reports," she said, her gaze piercing. "We're here to change lives. I don't want another mother to bury her child because someone saw them as a threat instead of a person." The room fell silent as her words resonated. David looked around, seeing the determination in the faces of the board members, and realized the depth of the commitment they were bringing to this task. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that this board could be the catalyst for real change, a force capable of transforming not just the police department, but the city as a whole. Meanwhile, outside the formal settings of the board meetings, David and Malone's paths continued to intersect in unexpected ways. One evening, David was invited to a community forum at a local church where residents were gathering to discuss the future of policing in their neighborhoods. As he entered the crowded room, he noticed Malone sitting quietly in a back row, almost blending into the shadows. David was surprised but encouraged by his presence. It was clear that Malone, too, was attempting to engage with the community, to better understand the people he was meant to protect and serve. When the floor opened for public comments, a young man stood up, his voice filled with frustration. "It's all well and good to talk about change, but what about the officers who don't want it? the ones who don't see us as human. He looked directly at Malone, his gaze challenging. How can we trust that anything will be different? Malone shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he stood up, his voice quiet yet resolute. I can't speak for every officer, he began, choosing his words carefully. But I can say this. I've made mistakes. I've let my assumptions guide my actions, and I'm sorry for that. I'm here because I want to do better. I want to understand, and I want to be part of a department that serves this community with respect. His honesty hung in the air, and the room remained silent, processing his words. After a moment, David spoke up, building on Malone's admission. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, he said, addressing the room. But it starts with accountability, with officers like Malone recognizing their mistakes and committing to doing better. And it requires all of us to be part of that process, to hold each other accountable and to support each other in building a community where everyone is seen, respected, and valued. The forum ended with a renewed sense of purpose, and as people filed out, several community members approached Malone, offering him words of encouragement and sharing their experiences. For Malone, it was a humbling experience, a reminder of the trust he needed to earn, one interaction at a time. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take root. The police department launched a series of community engagement programs, partnering officers with local organizations and hosting Meet the Beat events, where residents could interact with the officers assigned to their neighborhoods. These initiatives, though small, began to break down the barriers between law enforcement and the people they served, creating opportunities for genuine connections and understanding. David, too, became deeply involved in these programs, working alongside both officers and residents to facilitate open dialogues. He organized workshops at schools, bringing in officers to speak with students about their roles and responsibilities, and encouraged students to voice their own perspectives on safety and justice. These conversations were often difficult, filled with raw emotions and painful stories, but they were essential to bridging the gap of distrust that had plagued the community for so long. One day, David was approached by a high school senior named Marcus, who had been following the events closely. Judge Taylor, Marcus said, his eyes filled with determination. I want to be a lawyer one day. I want to help change the system from the inside, like you're doing. David felt a surge of pride and hope as he shook Marcus's hand, realizing that the ripple effects of this movement were already reaching the next generation. For Malone, the journey was just beginning. Each day was a lesson in humility and growth, and he continued to attend community meetings, often standing in silence as he absorbed the stories and frustrations of those who had suffered under the weight of prejudice. He began to understand that being a good officer wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about building trust and earning the respect of the people he served. He found himself questioning his initial beliefs, reevaluating his motivations, and striving to become not just a better officer but a better human being. Months after the initial incident, the city held a public gathering in the main square to celebrate the progress that had been made and to recommit to the journey ahead. David was invited to speak, and as he looked out over the crowd, he saw a city transformed, a city that had faced its flaws and emerged stronger, more unified, and more committed to justice. He spoke of hope, of the power of collective action, and of the importance of accountability. He reminded everyone that true change was a continuous process, one that required vigilance, empathy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. As the gathering concluded, David spotted Malone in the crowd. The young officer approached him, his expression one of gratitude and respect. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Malone said quietly. "I still have a long way to go, but I'm committed to seeing this through." David nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Malone's shoulder. "The journey toward justice is never easy," he replied, "but as long as we're willing to learn and grow, there's always hope." That evening, as the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow across the skyline, David walked through the streets, reflecting on how far they had come. He knew there was still work to be done, still battles to be fought, But for the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of optimism. The city had faced its darkness and chosen the light, and David, along with the community, was ready to keep pushing forward, united in their vision of a more just and compassionate world. As the months went by, the city experienced a profound transformation, marked by a sense of renewal and unity that many had never seen before. The Independent Review Board was now fully operational, examining cases with a rigor and transparency that built trust with the community. People had started to notice the tangible differences, officers walking their beats and engaging in conversation, rather than patrolling in cars with closed windows. The city's sense of community pride was growing, and both residents and law enforcement seemed to recognize they were all part of the same collective story. Judge David Taylor found his role evolving in ways he hadn't anticipated. No longer simply a judge overseeing criminal cases, he had become a trusted advisor and advocate for justice reform in every sector of the city. Schools, businesses, and local nonprofits invited him to speak on racial bias, fairness, and equity. He became a mentor to young, aspiring lawyers and activists, holding seminars on law and ethics, hoping to inspire a new generation of advocates who would uphold the principles of justice that had guided him throughout his career. David's life had become a balancing act, maintaining his judicial responsibilities while guiding a movement that was now inseparable from his own identity. One evening, David attended a community dinner organized by a coalition of local leaders and neighborhood associations. The event was held in the heart of the city, in a converted warehouse decorated with string lights and local artwork. Long communal tables were set with simple, elegant dishes donated by local restaurants, and the air was filled with a hum of conversation and laughter. It was an evening of unity, a celebration of the progress they had made and the hard work that lay ahead. As David sat down, he found himself across from Leila Jackson, the grandmother and activist who had so passionately spoken at the first review board meeting. She had become a close ally, someone whose wisdom and life experiences lent invaluable insight to every decision they made on the board. She smiled warmly at him, reaching out to touch his hand. "David," she said softly, "I can't tell you how proud I am to see this city finally making a real change. It's what my son would have wanted." Her eyes glistened, and David felt a deep sense of gratitude, both for her trust and for the chance to honor the memory of those who had suffered injustices in silence. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sean Malone, who had come to the dinner alone, wearing a simple button-down shirt and a nervous smile. David noticed him immediately, feeling a surge of both pride and empathy for the young officer who had, over the past few months, shown a remarkable dedication to understanding the depth of his past mistakes. The road had not been easy for Malone. The journey to regain the trust of the community was long and demanding. Each time he attended a community event, he was reminded of the damage his actions had caused and the work he had yet to do to make amends. Malone caught David's eye and made his way over, extending his hand. "Judge Taylor," he began, his voice steady but respectful, "I just wanted to thank you. If it weren't for you and everyone here, I don't think I would have seen things the way I do now. I'm not the same person I was that day." David shook his hand, nodding solemnly. "It takes courage to confront ourselves, Sean," he replied. "Growth isn't easy, and change takes time. But you're here, and that means something." As the evening progressed, David and Malone spoke at length, joined by community leaders and activists who shared their own stories of transformation. Many of them had once been skeptical of any hope for change, their lives marred by experiences of discrimination and injustice. But now, sitting side by side with people from all walks of life, they were beginning to feel that a real shift was happening. They shared stories, laughed, and even shed a few tears, finding a shared humanity in their differences. Then, as the dinner was winding down, a young girl approached David and Malone. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, with bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity and hope. She had been watching them from across the room, and finally she summoned the courage to approach. "Are you the judge and the policeman everyone's been talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David and Malone exchanged a glance, both of them smiling. "Yes, we are," David replied warmly. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said, looking down shyly before gathering her confidence. "I wanted to say thank you. My mom says that what you're doing is really important, that it's going to make things better for everyone. Is that true?" David knelt down to her level, his voice gentle but firm. "We're trying, Amara," he said. "We want to make this city a place where everyone feels safe, where everyone is treated with respect, and we're working hard to make sure that happens." Malone looked at Amara. His expression softened. "Your mom's right, Amara," he added. "We're doing everything we can to make sure this city is fair for everyone. And with young people like you growing up here, I think we're in good hands." Amara beamed, her eyes bright with pride, before running back to her mother, who smiled at David and Malone with gratitude. In that moment, David realized the profound impact this movement was having, not just on the adults fighting for change, but on the children who would one day inherit the world they were building. The changes soon began to ripple beyond the city. Other towns and cities took notice of the work happening under the new review board, of the community police partnerships, and of the commitment to transparency and accountability. News outlets from across the state came to document what had begun as a painful confrontation and transformed into a model of reconciliation and reform. David and Malone were invited to speak at conferences, their story becoming an example of what was possible when communities united to demand justice and accountability. But the road wasn't without its challenges. There were still some officers who resisted the changes, clinging to old mindsets and resenting the increased scrutiny. And there were those in the community who remained skeptical, unwilling to forgive or forget the years of mistreatment. There were tense moments, and not every encounter between police and residents went perfectly. But each incident was met with swift accountability, with the review board providing oversight and ensuring that the community's trust was honored. As time passed, David and Malone found themselves working together more frequently. They became unlikely allies in the pursuit of a shared vision, each one learning from the other. Malone took every opportunity to join community outreach programs, volunteering at local schools, and participating in workshops about implicit bias and the importance of empathy. His humility and determination to grow gradually earned him the respect of people who had once viewed him with suspicion and resentment. David, on the other hand, found himself embracing a more active role in advocacy. He continued to push for systemic reforms, working closely with the review board to establish new policies that prioritized de-escalation, empathy, and communication. He advocated for training that focused not just on enforcing the law, but on understanding the complex social dynamics that shaped people's lives. And he worked tirelessly to secure funding for youth programs, mentorship opportunities, and resources that would give young people in underserved neighborhoods a brighter future. 1 year after the incident, the city held a commemoration to celebrate the progress they had made. It was held in the same park where the first protest had taken place, a powerful reminder of how far they had come. The event drew people from across the city, families, students, business owners, police officers, and activists, all gathered to honor the journey that had transformed their community. David was invited to speak, and as he looked out over the crowd, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "A year ago, we faced a difficult truth about our city," he began. "But instead of turning away, we chose to confront it. We chose to hold ourselves and each other accountable. And today, we are stronger because of it." He gestured to Malone, who stood beside him, visibly moved. "This isn't just my journey. It's Seen's journey, it's Leela's journey, it's Amara's journey. It's all of ours. Together, we've built something that will last. But our work isn't finished. We must continue to grow, to learn, to listen, and to lift each other up. Because that's what makes a community. That's what makes us stronger." The crowd erupted in applause, and as David looked around, he saw faces filled with hope, resilience, and a determination to continue the path they had started. There were no illusions that the work was over, but there was a collective commitment to keep going. As the sun began to set on that warm evening, casting a golden glow over the park, David and Malone stood side by side, watching as families and friends embraced, children laughed, and people shared stories of healing and progress. The city had been transformed, and so had they. David felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the legacy they were building would endure, shaping the lives of future generations and serving as a testament to the power of unity, compassion, and the courage to confront even the most uncomfortable truths. A full year had passed since that transformative evening in the park, yet the momentum of change continued to ripple through the city. The reforms had taken root in every corner of the community, and a sense of cautious optimism replaced the lingering resentment and mistrust that once permeated the streets. However, Judge David Taylor understood all too well that maintaining this hard-won progress would require dedication, vigilance, and the ongoing commitment of both the city's leaders and its residents. His own life had been irrevocably changed by the incident and the movement it had sparked. He was no longer simply a judge confined to the four walls of his courtroom. He had become a steadfast advocate for justice reform, using his voice to push for deeper changes not only in the justice system, but in the entire social fabric of the city. The Independent Review Board, which had once been met with skepticism, was now viewed as a vital pillar of accountability. It had handled several cases of misconduct with a thoroughness and transparency that gradually earned the trust of both the police force and the community. David continued to serve as an advisor to the board, providing insight into complex cases and offering guidance on how best to navigate the delicate relationship between law enforcement and the community. The board's reports were made public, showcasing both their findings and the steps taken to address each incident. This openness fostered a level of trust and respect that was unprecedented, a trust that David knew could easily be lost if they ever grew complacent. David often thought back to the moment in the cafe when his life had changed so dramatically. The memory of that day, of the young officer who had mistaken him for a suspect, lingered as a stark reminder of the fragility of justice. It was a reminder of the countless lives shaped by the biases, assumptions, and inequities woven into society. David's role on the review board was more than just professional, it was personal. He saw every case through the lens of his own experience, balancing his responsibility to the law with his deep empathy for those who had been wronged. For Officer Sean Malone, the journey had been transformative in ways he could never have anticipated. The aftermath of the incident had forced him to confront painful truths about his own biases and the role he played in perpetuating a flawed system. His journey wasn't an easy one, and he faced criticism not just from the community, but from within himself. However, each day he took small steps toward being a better person and a better officer. He continued attending community meetings and worked closely with outreach programs that paired officers with local youth, fostering a sense of trust and camaraderie between law enforcement and the city's youngest residents. He had also become an advocate within the police force for sensitivity training, speaking out in favor of programs that many of his colleagues had once dismissed as unnecessary. At the police precinct, Malone's growth had made him a respected, if somewhat unexpected, voice for reform. Some officers initially saw him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen if one failed to navigate the city's complex social landscape. But over time, as his dedication became apparent, he began to earn their respect. Malone's vulnerability and honesty about his mistakes set an example that resonated with younger officers. They saw in him a path that wasn't about denying one's flaws, but rather about confronting them openly and using them as a stepping stone to improvement. He was no longer the young officer driven solely by a desire to enforce the law. He had become a protector in the truest sense, someone who believed that his role was to serve and uplift the community he had once misunderstood. A pivotal moment came when Malone was promoted to a new role as the department's community liaison officer, a position designed to bridge the gap between the police force and the residents. It was a role that hadn't existed before, but one that was a direct result of the city's commitment to lasting change. As a liaison, Malone spent his days meeting with community leaders, attending neighborhood events, and actively listening to the concerns of residents. He became a familiar face at local schools, community centers, and town hall meetings. Slowly, the community began to see him not as the officer who had once wrongfully accused their judge, but as a man who had chosen to change, someone who had proven that redemption was possible. One evening, David and Malone were both invited to a citywide youth summit, an annual event where students from various schools gathered to discuss topics such as leadership, responsibility, and justice. The event had taken on new meaning in recent years, becoming a symbol of the city's commitment to nurturing its young leaders. As David walked into the auditorium, he was struck by the sight of hundreds of students, their faces filled with curiosity and excitement, ready to learn from those who had come before them. David was slated to deliver the keynote speech, but before he took the stage, he noticed Malone speaking with a small group of students near the front row. The students were listening intently, asking questions and sharing their own thoughts on what it meant to be a leader. David watched as Malone, with a newfound humility and sense of purpose, encouraged the students to pursue their passions, to question assumptions, and to approach every person with empathy and understanding. It was a powerful moment, one that underscored the profound changes that had taken place over the past year. When David took the stage, he began by sharing his own story, recounting the journey from that fateful day in the cafe to the reforms that had reshaped the city. Leadership isn't just about standing in front of a crowd or making decisions in a courtroom, he said, his voice calm but resonant. It's about listening, learning, and growing. It's about having the courage to admit when we're wrong and the determination to make things right. He looked out over the audience, his gaze landing on Malone, who nodded in silent acknowledgement. David's speech was met with a standing ovation, and as he stepped off the stage, he was greeted by dozens of students eager to shake his hand and thank him for his words. Among them was a young woman named Tasha, a senior at a local high school and an aspiring attorney. She had been following the city's journey closely, inspired by the resilience and determination of both David and Malone. "Judge Taylor," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I want to be a lawyer one day like you. I want to help people, to make sure that justice isn't just a word, but a reality." David placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of pride and encouragement. "You can, Tasha, and you will. Keep your heart open, and never lose sight of what's right. The world needs more people like you, people who believe in justice and aren't afraid to stand up for it." The summit left David and Malone feeling deeply inspired. They saw the future of their city reflected in the eyes of those students, a future built on empathy, respect, and mutual understanding. Together, they left the auditorium with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that their efforts were helping to shape a better world for the next generation. In the months that followed, the city continued to evolve. The review board remained a central part of the justice system, handling cases with the same transparency and fairness that had come to define it. Police reforms were now codified into law, with officers required to undergo annual sensitivity training, de-escalation exercises, and community engagement activities. These measures didn't erase the past, but they offered a path forward, a framework within which the city could continue to grow and heal. For David, the journey had been transformative in ways he hadn't expected. He felt a profound sense of purpose that transcended his role as a judge. He had seen firsthand the power of community, of the strength that emerged when people came together with a shared vision. He knew that the work of justice was never truly complete, that every day would bring new challenges, but he was ready to face them, fortified by the lessons he had learned and the bonds he had formed. As for Malone, his journey was far from over. He knew that redemption was not a destination, but a continual process of growth, accountability, and dedication. He had been given a second chance, a chance to redefine what it meant to be an officer, and he wasn't about to waste it. His role as a community liaison had taught him that trust was fragile, that it required constant nurturing, and an unwavering commitment to serve with integrity. One evening, David and Malone met for dinner at the same cafe where their journey had begun. It was a quiet evening, the cafe filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. They sat by the window, reflecting on the year that had passed, the challenges they had overcome, and the bond they had formed through their shared commitment to justice. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Malone said, a faint smile on his face as he stirred his coffee. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." David chuckled, nodding. "It does, but look how far we've come. This city, you, me, we've all grown, and it's because we didn't give up." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker outside the window. Finally, Malone looked over at David, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Judge, for not just forgiving me, but for showing me that change is possible. I don't think I could have done this without you." David placed a hand on Malone's shoulder, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We're in this together, Scene. And as long as we keep working, keep learning, and keep listening, I believe we can build a city where justice truly belongs to everyone." As they left the cafe, walking side by side through the city they both loved, they knew that the journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next.